On the southern wing of the Eastern Front in 1943, the Red Army was emerging from a sequence of crises and recoveries. The encirclement battles of 1941, the winter counteroffensive near Moscow, the defeats and partial recoveries around Kharkov, and the long struggle at Stalingrad had exposed both the strengths and weaknesses of Soviet command. By mid-war, the Soviet leadership was concentrating experienced generals into front commands, seeking officers who could plan large operations, hold gains, and avoid a repeat of earlier encirclements. Among them, Fyodor Ivanovich Tolbukhin, a career officer from Yaroslavl province who had risen from captain in the Imperial Army to Marshal of the Soviet Union, took over formations that would become central to the southern campaigns of 1943 to 1945. At the same time, German strategy in the south was under pressure. Army Group South, later split and renamed multiple times, had to defend an extended front from the lower Dnieper to the Sea of Azov, then to Romania and the Balkans. Fuel shortages, stretched rail lines from the Reich, and the loss of key industrial regions such as the Donbass constrained German options. Yet the area remained economically and politically important. The lower Dnieper hydropower facilities, the access routes toward the Caucasus and the Black Sea, the Ploesti oil fields in Romania, and the transport corridors into the Balkans all converged in the sectors where Tolbukhin's fronts would operate. The Wehrmacht and its Axis allies therefore committed significant formations, including rebuilt elements of the German Sixth Army and Romanian armies, to hold this zone. Within the Soviet command system, Tolbukhin's wartime career had already passed through staff work and army-level command. As commander of the 57th Army at Stalingrad, he had worked under Andrei Yeremenko and gained a reputation for orderly headquarters procedures and careful preparation of attacks. In March 1943, he was appointed to lead the Southern Front, which in October was redesignated the 4th Ukrainian Front. Under this headquarters, he directed the Melitopol offensive from 26 September to 5 November 1943, deploying multiple armies and air assets to break the German positions along the Panther-Wotan line and liberate Melitopol at the cost of at least 43,000 Soviet killed, seriously wounded, missing or captured, and 155,000 wounded, against German Sixth Army losses of several tens of thousands in killed, wounded, and missing. The Stavka's broader plan for late 1943 and 1944 envisaged a stepwise advance from the lower Dnieper toward Crimea, Bessarabia, and the Balkans, while central and northern fronts pushed toward Belarus and Poland. In this design, Tolbukhin's formations on the southern axis were expected to do more than simply advance. They were tasked with executing encirclements and destroying German operational groupings that might otherwise retreat in good order and reinforce other sectors. These expectations formed the backdrop for a sequence of operations in which Tolbukhin, first with the 4th and later with the 3rd Ukrainian Front, would repeatedly combine frontal pressure with flanking maneuvers and river crossings, aiming to close pockets rather than merely push the front line westward. In May 1944, Tolbukhin was transferred to command the 3rd Ukrainian Front, which by then controlled multiple combined arms armies, a tank army, and the Danube flotilla, and cooperated closely with 2nd Ukrainian Front on its northern flank. Over the next year, this front conducted the Jassy-Kishinev offensive, contributing to the destruction of Army Group South Ukraine and Romania's change of sides, advanced through Bulgaria, took part in the liberation of Belgrade in cooperation with Yugoslav partisans, engaged German and Hungarian forces in the siege of Budapest and in the Lake Balaton sector, and finally advanced into Austria and captured Vienna in April 1945. Post-war public memory, both in the Soviet Union and abroad, often highlighted commanders such as Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev associated with the defense of Moscow, the Battle of Kursk, and the final assault on Berlin. Tolbukhin, though awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union and the Order of Victory, and honoured in several Balkan states, was more closely linked to southern operations and to the complex politics of Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Austria. The capital of one Bulgarian region, Dobrich, even carried his name for several decades, reflecting his association with the Soviet advance into the Balkans. This documentary examines why, despite a record in which his fronts did not suffer major operational defeats after 1943, Tolbukhin remained less prominent in popular narratives than some of his contemporaries. It follows his command of the southern 4th Ukrainian and 3rd Ukrainian fronts through the decisive campaigns of 1943 to 1945. The Melitopol offensive, the Crimean operation, the Jassy-Kishinev encirclement, the advance into the Balkans, the defense against German counteroffensives near Lake Balaton, and the capture of Vienna. At each stage, it sets Soviet planning and execution against German and Axis intentions, evaluates the scale of encirclements and withdrawals on both sides, and considers how political factors, coalition warfare, and later historiography shaped Tolbukhin's reputation. In the late summer and autumn of 1943, the sector assigned to Tolbukhin was one of transition rather than dramatic breakthroughs. After the Battle of Kursk and the Soviet advances in central Ukraine, the southern arc of the front still ran along rivers and fortified belts that the German command hoped to hold through the winter. Army Group South, under Erich von Manstein, retained several experienced formations, including the reconstituted 6th Army, parts of 1st Panzer Army, and allied Romanian and other Axis units. Their mission was to anchor on the lower Dnieper, the Moloknaya River, and the defensive works of the Panther-Wotan line, buying time for Germany to stabilise the overall front and protect the approaches to the Crimea and to Romania. For the Soviet side, this zone contained several overlapping objectives. The Stavka wanted to secure the Donbass industrial region, open routes toward the lower Dnieper crossings, and create conditions for a later operation against Crimea. Tolbukhin's front occupied the southernmost portion of this offensive arc. North of him, Malinovsky and other front commanders pressed toward Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia. To the south, the Azov Sea and the narrow isthmuses leading to Crimea constrained manoeuvre, but also offered possibilities for isolating German and Romanian forces on the peninsula. The opening phase of Tolbukhin's campaign thus began not with a single decisive thrust, but with a series of methodical advances and regroupings. His armies, which included combined arms formations such as the 28th, 44th and 51st Armies and supporting tank and mechanized corps, had to cross multiple water obstacles and breach several bands of field fortifications. Artillery units were brought forward along damaged railways and improvised roads, while engineer troops prepared crossings and cleared minefields. Air support was coordinated with the 8th Air Army and neighbouring air formations to suppress German strongpoints and interdict reserves moving along the north-south rail lines feeding the lower Dnieper and Melitopol sectors. On the Axis side, the command structure was complex. German divisions, some rebuilt after losses at Stalingrad and in the Donbass, held key strongpoints and counterattack reserves. Romanian formations, including elements of 3rd and 4th Armies, secured secondary sectors and rear areas, while logistical units worked to evacuate equipment and personnel toward the west bank of the Dnieper and into Crimea. German staff officers viewed the southern front as a place where losses had to be managed carefully. Too rapid a retreat could expose Crimea and Romania. Too rigid a defence risked encirclement in the open steppe. Within Tolbukhin's headquarters, the initial decisions centred on where to concentrate limited mobile forces and how to coordinate with neighbouring fronts to avoid creating exposed salients. Intelligence sections assessed German intentions primarily through prisoner interrogations, aerial reconnaissance, and radio intercepts. Reports indicated that German units were preparing fallback lines, but still intended to fight hard for key nodes such as Melitopol. which controlled road and rail routes between the lower Dnieper and the Azov coast. Tolbukhin's staff responded by planning phased operations, first to break the forward defences, then to pivot forces to cut lines of retreat, rather than relying on a single rapid penetration. For the local population in southern Ukraine, this opening phase meant repeated changes of control and the movement of large forces through agricultural regions already affected by occupation, requisitions, and earlier fighting. Villages along the main axes saw Soviet reconnaissance units advance, withdraw, and advance again as both sides probed for weaknesses. Civilians encountered different military administrations in quick succession and had to adapt to shifting demands for labor, supplies, and information without knowing how long any given front line would remain in place. By the time the offensive operations toward Melitopol were ready to begin in late September 1943, the basic outlines of Tolbukhin's command style in this theatre had been set. His front was positioned at the junction of strategic priorities: the need to secure the southern flank of the Soviet advance into Ukraine, the desire to isolate or destroy large German formations rather than simply push them back, and the requirement to coordinate with multiple allies and neighbouring fronts. The decisions taken in this initial period would shape how his forces entered the major battles that followed, from the Melitopol offensive to the subsequent drive toward Crimea. While fighting continued along the existing front, planning staffs on both sides worked from assumptions that went beyond the immediate line of contact. For the Soviet command, directives to Tolbukhin's front defined a chain of linked objectives: breach the German field fortifications between the lower Dnieper and the Azov Sea, capture Melitopol as a transport hub, cut the main withdrawal routes of Sixth Army, and create positions from which an offensive toward Crimea could be launched. These aims were framed in the language of deep operations. The task was not only to force the enemy back, but to disrupt his operational system, sever his communications, and prevent the orderly transfer of formations to other sectors. To serve these goals, Tolbukhin's staff organized his armies into echelons and shock groupings, assigning rifle divisions and corps to break through on selected sectors, while mobile units prepared to exploit any gap. Artillery commanders calculated densities of guns and mortars per kilometre of front, aiming to reach values sufficient to crush forward strongpoints and neutralize enemy batteries. Engineer units were tasked with bridging streams, preparing passage through mine belts, and restoring tracks for the movement of guns and supplies. Air Army headquarters coordinated plans for concentrated sorties against identified command posts, bridges, and railway nodes, in order to slow German redeployments once the ground offensive began. The German and Axis High Command in the south formulated their plans in response to both local and wider constraints. The defence of the Panther-Wotan positions near Melitopol was not an end in itself, but part of an attempt to maintain a continuous front line shielding the Dnieper crossings, Crimea, and the approaches to Romania. Orders emphasised a combination of fixed defences and elastic response. Forward positions were to be held firmly, but divisions were also instructed to prepare fallback lines and maintain reserves capable of counter-attacking Soviet penetrations. The overarching aim was to trade space in a controlled way, inflict heavy casualties, and keep combat formations intact for later operations. Logistics weighed heavily on these calculations. Soviet rear services had to move ammunition, fuel, and replacements over long distances from the Volga and central industrial regions to improvised depots in southern Ukraine. Railways damaged by earlier fighting and German demolitions were repaired under air threat. Truck columns crossed steppe regions where autumn rains could reduce roads to deep mud. Tolbukhin's planning conferences therefore linked the timing of offensives to the readiness of rail links, stockpiles within artillery range, and the availability of bridging equipment. Plans included scheduled pauses for regrouping, reflecting an effort to avoid exhausting assault troops in continuous attacks without adequate supply. On the German and Romanian side, supply lines ran southward and westward toward the Dnieper crossings, ports on the Black Sea, and the rail systems of Romania, fuel and ammunition allocations were already constrained by demands from other theatres and by Allied air attacks on transport and oil installations. Staff estimates tried to balance the requirement to hold exposed salients with the need to avoid losing large quantities of material in sudden retreats. In practice, this meant pre-planned demolitions of infrastructure and phased evacuation of depots, which could reduce the immediate fighting power of frontline units in order to preserve resources for later use. Both sides made assumptions that would interact with Tolbukhin's operational decisions. Soviet intelligence analysts judged that German units had been weakened by earlier withdrawals and that their ability to conduct large-scale counterattacks was limited. But they also warned of the possibility that armoured reserves could be shifted rapidly along the remaining intact railways. German commanders, for their part, often estimated that Soviet forces would require longer pauses to restore their logistics than actually proved necessary, and counted on defensive belts and natural obstacles to slow any advance. Propaganda and political messaging framed these preparations differently for various audiences. Soviet newspapers presented the forthcoming operations as a continuation of the liberation of Ukraine and the expulsion of occupiers, emphasizing the role of soldiers from multiple republics and the support of local populations. German communications to troops stressed the defense of Europe's southeastern flank, the protection of vital resources, and the need to delay the Red Army far from the borders of Allied states such as Romania and Hungary. Among civilians in the contested areas, plans made in distant headquarters translated into expectations of renewed fighting, requisitions, and further waves of evacuation or forced labour, whatever the outcome of the coming battles. The Melitopol offensive began on September 26, 1943, with a prolonged artillery preparation along sectors chosen for penetration. Tolbukhin's front committed several rifle corps in the first echelon, supported by tank and self-propelled artillery units equipped with T-34s, light tanks, and assault guns. Infantry advanced across open steppe, broken by villages, tree belts, and field fortifications, while German forces of 6th Army, entrenched in multiple defence lines, responded with pre-registered artillery fire and local counterattacks. In the first days, Soviet units recorded gains measured in individual strongpoints and trench systems rather than deep breakthroughs, revealing the resilience of the German main line around Melitopol. Initial Soviet reports noted that the depth of the German defensive system had been underestimated. Forward positions, thought to be outposts, often formed only the first band of a layered system, including anti-tank ditches, minefields, and reinforced urban sectors inside Melitopol itself. As rifle divisions suffered rising casualty counts and tank brigades lost vehicles to mines and anti-tank guns, Tolbukhin's staff recognized that the offensive, as originally configured, risked becoming an attritional struggle without decisive effect. The front command temporarily reduced the tempo on some axes, shifted artillery groups, and prepared a new concentration on the northern flank of the Melitopol sector. German accounts from the same period describe the use of flexible tactics within the framework of a fixed defensive mission. Frontline units withdrew from individual positions when threatened with envelopment, then launched counterattacks with available reserves, including assault guns and tanks, moved along interior roads. The aim was to restore local lines and inflict losses, while higher headquarters continued to plan for a possible withdrawal to more westerly positions if the situation became untenable. The presence of Romanian and other Allied units in neighbouring sectors required coordination across linguistic and organisational boundaries, adding complexity to the defence. Civilians inside and around Melitopol experienced this opening phase as alternating waves of bombardment and infantry combat. The city's pre-war population had already been reduced by evacuations, deportations, and forced labour, but many residents remained in basements, improvised shelters, or nearby villages. As Soviet artillery struck railway facilities, depots, and command posts, fires and building collapses became frequent. German authorities organized further evacuations of administrative personnel and skilled workers, while requisitioning transport and supplies from local inhabitants. For those living in rural areas along the front, daily life was shaped by the movement of columns, digging of new trenches, and the risk of being caught between lines during Soviet attacks or German counterthrusts. After several days of costly frontal assaults, Tolbukhin implemented a revised plan. The main effort was shifted to the north of Melitopol, where terrain and road networks offered better conditions for maneuver. Additional artillery and tank units were redeployed to this sector, and the front's air formations were tasked with intensifying strikes against German reserves and transport routes feeding the city. The change required rapid staff work, including the reallocation of supply priorities and the redirection of engineer resources to prepare new axes of advance. On the German side, this adjustment was detected through aerial reconnaissance and frontline reports. Commanders concluded that the Soviet front was attempting to outflank the strongest fortifications and threaten the rear of Melitopol's garrison. In response, they shifted available mobile reserves and increased efforts to hold key road junctions north and northwest of the city. However, limited fuel stocks and competing demands along the wider front restricted the scale of these countermeasures. The balance between holding ground and preserving the integrity of divisions became increasingly difficult to maintain. By mid-October, these first engagements around Melitopol had demonstrated several features that would recur in Tolbukhin's later campaigns. The use of initial assaults to test and wear down enemy defences, willingness to adjust the direction of the main blow when resistance proved stronger than anticipated, and reliance on coordination between artillery, armour and air power to open gaps for exploitation. At the same time, the fighting underscored the costs of attacking prepared positions and the capacity of German and Axis forces, even in retreat, to impose significant losses and delay on advancing Soviet formations. As the fighting around Melitopol entered its second and third weeks, the scale of the engagement expanded beyond the immediate city sector. Tolbukhin's front received additional rifle divisions and reinforcing tank and self-propelled artillery regiments, some redeployed from quieter stretches of the southern arc. Reserve artillery brigades were moved forward to increase fire density on the chosen axes north of the city. This redistribution of forces created new pressure points along the German line, but it also strained Soviet supply columns, which had to feed more guns and vehicles across damaged infrastructure and in deteriorating autumn weather. On the German side, 6th Army and higher headquarters committed the bulk of their available reserves to this threatened sector. Divisions that had already been weakened in earlier engagements were ordered to hold ground or counterattack, drawing on remaining armoured units and assault gun battalions. The concentration of forces around Melitopol inevitably left other parts of the front more thinly held, but commanders judged that losing this node would expose the entire southern wing and accelerate Soviet movement toward Crimea and the lower Dnieper. For Romanian units in adjacent sectors, the intensifying Soviet artillery and air attacks meant higher casualties and growing uncertainty about whether German support could be maintained at the same level. The escalation was not only quantitative, but also qualitative. Soviet attacks increasingly combined night movements, short but concentrated artillery barrages, and coordinated strikes by infantry and armour against identified weak points. Tolbukhin's staff monitored unit reports to identify sectors where German formations were falling back without orders, or where counterattacks were launched with reduced strength, interpreting these as signs of overextension. German commanders, meanwhile, reported ammunition expenditure rates that exceeded planned allocations and fuel stocks that limited the ability of panzer and assault gun units to respond quickly along the line. For soldiers on both sides, the crisis phase translated into longer periods at the front and reduced opportunities for rest. Soviet riflemen advancing through mined fields and shell-damaged villages faced sustained small arms and mortar fire, while German infantry defending successive trench lines had to repel repeated assaults. often with shrinking stocks of grenades and anti-tank weapons. Medical services struggled to evacuate wounded over muddy tracks under observation. Field hospitals operated close to capacity. The accumulation of casualties, combined with the movement of replacements unfamiliar with local terrain or unit traditions, altered the composition and cohesion of many formations. Civilians in the contested zone experienced this escalation as a progressive breakdown of what remained of normal life. In Melitopol and nearby settlements, the intensification of bombardments led to further destruction of housing, utilities, and public buildings. German authorities accelerated the evacuation of administrative structures, industrial equipment, and forced labor contingents, often commandeering carts and vehicles from local residents. As Soviet forces drew closer, some civilians attempted to move westward with retreating columns, while others remained in place, uncertain about the implications of another regime change, and constrained by lack of transport or the presence of elderly relatives and children. By mid-October 1943, Soviet penetrations north of Melitopol threatened to unhinge the defensive system around the city. Tolbukhin ordered a renewed push to deepen these gains, aiming to force German units either to retreat hastily or to risk partial encirclement. This required his front to sustain high offensive intensity across a broad frontage, even as wear and tear on equipment accumulated. Reports from tank brigades recorded growing numbers of vehicles out of action due to mechanical failures and battle damage, while artillery units reported barrel wear affecting accuracy. The front's rear services had to decide which sectors would receive priority for spare parts and fuel, knowing that choices made at this stage could determine the success of subsequent encirclement attempts. German decision-makers now faced a choice between continuing to hold the Melitopol positions or conducting an organized withdrawal to avoid larger losses. Maintaining the line promised more time to prepare subsequent defenses and evacuate resources, but every day of delay increased the risk that Soviet forces could cut the main roads and railways leading toward the Dnieper and Crimea. Orders were issued for phased withdrawals from some forward sectors, combined with rearguard actions intended to slow Soviet pursuit. However, the speed of Soviet advances on certain axes and disruptions caused by artillery and air attacks made strict adherence to these plans difficult. The crisis extended beyond the immediate battlefield. The gradual loss of the Panther-Wotan positions and the approach of Soviet forces toward the isthmuses leading into Crimea raised concerns in German and Romanian political circles about the future of the peninsula and the security of the Black Sea flank. For the Soviet leadership, the emerging opportunity to isolate German 17th Army in Crimea had to be weighed against the logistical burden of maintaining offensives along multiple fronts. Tolbukhin's operations thus intersected with higher-level discussions about priorities in the upcoming winter and spring campaigns. By late October, the combined effect of sustained Soviet pressure and the overstretch of German and Axis resources produced a situation in which large segments of the front around Melitopol could no longer be held without disproportionate losses. The city changed hands after intense fighting in urban streets and industrial districts, leaving substantial physical damage and a layered legacy of occupation and liberation in the eyes of local inhabitants. German forces, though avoiding a complete encirclement of 6th Army, were compelled to withdraw to new lines farther west, while elements covering the approaches to Crimea now operated under increased threat of isolation. For Tolbukhin's front, the conclusion of the Melitopol offensive did not bring a pause so much as a shift in focus. The need to consolidate gains, repair infrastructure, and absorb replacements coincided with preparations for the next major objective, the reduction of the Crimean bridgehead and the reconfiguration of the southern flank of the Eastern Front. The crisis had revealed both the capacity of his command to adjust plans under pressure and the continuing ability of German and Axis forces to conduct fighting withdrawals. These lessons would shape the planning and execution of the subsequent Crimean operation, in which questions of encirclement, evacuation, and the limits of defensive endurance would again come to the forefront. The winter of 1943 to 1944 turned Tolbukhin's attention toward the Crimean Peninsula, where German 17th Army, supported by Romanian formations, held an enclave that had once served as a base for Axis air and naval operations in the Black Sea. After the loss of Melitopol and the withdrawal from the lower Dnieper line, this grouping of roughly 200,000 to 230,000 troops, including German and Romanian divisions and support units, remained dependent on fragile land links across the Perekop Isthmus and the Sivash Lagoon, as well as on sea routes to ports such as Sevastopol. For the Soviet leadership, the continued Axis presence in Crimea represented both a military and political challenge. It threatened shipping, tied down forces, and symbolized an unresolved front in a region with pre-war economic and symbolic importance. Tolbukhin's Fourth Ukrainian Front, strengthened by the experience of the autumn campaign, prepared for a coordinated offensive together with the separate coastal army and the Black Sea Fleet. The front now controlled multiple combined arms armies, reinforced with tank and self-propelled artillery units, and supported by substantial artillery and air assets. Planning conferences in early 1944 focused on synchronizing attacks across the narrow land approaches with amphibious and airborne elements, while exploiting earlier Soviet gains on the north shore of the Sivash. Engineer units had already established and expanded bridgeheads in this shallow, difficult waterway, allowing infantry and heavy weapons to be moved into positions flanking the main Axis defences. The Axis command in Crimea faced an unfavourable balance of forces, but hoped to use the peninsula's geography to prolong resistance. Narrow approaches at Perekop and Chongar, combined with prepared fortifications and the strong points of Sevastopol, offered opportunities for delaying actions. German staff officers considered evacuation scenarios but were constrained by limited shipping capacity, the risk from Soviet air and naval forces, and political pressure to hold Sevastopol as a prestige position. Romanian formations, whose troops had already suffered significant losses on the Eastern Front, occupied sectors of the defensive perimeter and provided coastal and rear area security. The peak of Tolbukhin's southern campaign began in April 1944 with coordinated attacks on multiple fronts. Soviet forces pressed the Perekop Isthmus defences, expanded the Sivash bridgehead, and launched supporting amphibious landings on the eastern Crimean coast. Artillery concentrations, calculated to deliver high volumes of fire on narrow sectors, were used to neutralise strong points before infantry and armour advanced. The Black Sea Fleet and naval aviation bombarded coastal targets and disrupted sea transport, while bomber and ground attack aircraft targeted road and rail movements inside the peninsula. The intention was not only to break through, but to prevent an orderly withdrawal towards Sevastopol. As Soviet units advanced southward, Axis defences began to fragment. Some German and Romanian divisions managed phased retreats to secondary lines, while others were forced into hasty withdrawals under pressure. Commanders sought to concentrate forces in successive defensive arcs around key towns and ultimately around Sevastopol itself, hoping to repeat elements of the lengthy 1941 to 1942 defence. However, the changed balance of air and artillery power, and the presence of Soviet forces already operating across the Sivash and from the Kerch area, made it more difficult to maintain continuous lines. Columns of troops and equipment moving along Crimean roads came under frequent air attack, increasing losses and congestion. Civilians in Crimea, including Crimean Tatars, Russians, Ukrainians, and others, encountered rapid shifts in authority. Many had already endured years of occupation, forced labour, and deportations of specific groups under Axis rule. As front lines approached, German authorities intensified evacuations by sea and land, prioritising military personnel and selected civilian categories. At the same time, Soviet organs prepared to re-establish control, with implications for populations accused of collaboration or suspected disloyalty. For inhabitants of cities such as Simferopol and Sevastopol, the renewed siege conditions meant shortages of food and water, damaged infrastructure, and renewed artillery and air bombardment. By May 1944, Soviet forces under Tolbukhin on the northern Axis and his counterparts on the coastal army side had compressed the Axis troops into shrinking pockets. Sevastopol, defended by German and Romanian units that had retreated from the interior, came under concentrated artillery fire, including heavy guns brought into position after extensive engineering work. The combination of ground assaults from multiple directions, coastal bombardment, and the disruption of sea communications made further organized resistance increasingly difficult. When Sevastopol finally fell, surviving Axis troops attempted evacuation or were taken prisoner in significant numbers. An organized Axis presence in Crimea came to an end. Militarily, this phase represented a culmination of the southern campaigns that had begun with the struggle for the lower Dnieper and Melitopol. Tolbukhin's front, in conjunction with neighboring forces, had achieved not only territorial recovery, but the elimination of a substantial Axis grouping at the cost of high Soviet casualties and extensive material expenditure. The outcome secured the Soviet southern flank, freed forces for later operations toward Romania and the Balkans, and removed a long-standing Axis foothold in the Black Sea region. For Tolbukhin, it also established a pattern that would recur in subsequent operations. A methodical combination of frontal pressure, flank attacks, and coordinated use of artillery, armor, and air power to compress and dismantle enemy groupings, rather than merely pushing them back along a single axis. As Soviet forces completed the seizure of Crimea and regrouped on the lower Dniester, the character of the campaign shifted from reclaiming Soviet territory to operating in and around Allied and occupied states. Tolbukhin, now commanding the Third Ukrainian Front, had to adapt his methods to terrain marked by major rivers, hills, and urban centers, and to a political landscape involving Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and Hungary. The Jassy-Kishinev area in Moldavia became the next focal point, where German Sixth Army and Romanian formations constructed defensive lines intended to block a new Soviet advance toward the Balkans and the lower Danube. Resistance in this sector took multiple forms. On the Axis side, German staff work emphasized the reconstruction of defensive belts, the use of local counterattacks, and the deployment of armored reserves to contain Soviet penetrations. Romanian troops, some battle-worn and others newly raised, held stretches of the line while their political leadership weighed the costs of continued participation in the war against the Soviet Union. For Tolbukhin's front, the challenge lay in breaking a layered defense while preventing the enemy from disengaging in good order, as had happened in parts of Ukraine. The Jassy-Kishinev offensive in August 1944 demonstrated an adaptation in operational design. Tolbukhin and his northern neighbour coordinated deep penetrations by multiple armies, supported by concentrated artillery and air attacks, to encircle large Axis groupings rather than merely roll back their positions. Soviet Mobile Corps exploited gaps to reach road junctions and river crossings in the rear, creating pockets that compressed German and Romanian divisions. Under this pressure, existing patterns of resistance shifted. Many Romanian units began to disintegrate or withdraw independently, while German formations attempted breakout movements that frequently ran into prepared Soviet blocking lines. At the same time, political resistance to the existing Axis alignment in Romania moved into an active phase. The coup of 23 August 1944, in which King Michael and Allied politicians removed Ion Antonescu and declared a ceasefire with the Soviet Union, transformed the strategic situation on Tolbukhin's right. Romanian authorities now sought to limit destruction on their territory and to avoid further devastation during the transition, while German command structures tried to hold or retreat with remaining forces. Soviet headquarters, including Tolbukhin's, had to adjust rapidly to the presence of a former opponent, now treated as a co-belligerent, integrating Romanian formations into subsequent operations and regulating the conduct of advancing units on Romanian soil. Further south and west, resistance and adaptation took different forms. In Bulgaria, the government shifted from formal neutrality with Axis orientation toward alignment with the Soviet advance, while Bulgarian troops redeployed and reoriented their posture from guarding frontiers to participating in later operations against German forces in Yugoslavia and Hungary. Tolbukhin's planning staff incorporated Bulgarian formations into the growing coalition on his southern wing, while also coordinating with Yugoslav partisan forces, whose long-running resistance against German occupation had created local structures of authority and military units accustomed to irregular warfare. The Belgrade operation in autumn 1944 required Tolbukhin's front to combine conventional advances with cooperation alongside partisans familiar with the terrain and urban environment, German troops defending routes through eastern Yugoslavia, and the approaches to Belgrade attempted to delay the Soviet and Yugoslav advance by holding mountain passes, river crossings, and towns along major roads. Their resistance aimed to protect withdrawal routes toward Hungary and to maintain control of vital transport corridors as long as possible. In response, Tolbukhin's forces adapted by using mobile groups to bypass some strongpoints, leaving them to be reduced by follow-on units or local forces, thus conserving time and mechanized strength for deeper objectives. As operations moved into Hungary and toward the region around Lake Balaton, resistance from German and Hungarian formations took on a renewed intensity. The defense of Budapest and the later German counteroffensive in the Balaton area reflected attempts to stabilize the front and to protect remaining industrial and oil resources. Tolbukhin's front, now operating in conjunction with Second Ukrainian Front, had to adapt to dense urban fighting in Budapest, extended supply lines across multiple countries, and the need to absorb and counter organized panzer attacks in the Balaton sector. Defensive preparations, including anti-tank belts, minefields, and artillery zones, were reinforced in depth, reflecting lessons learned from earlier offensives and withdrawals on both sides. Throughout these stages, the psychological dimensions of resistance and adaptation were evident among soldiers and civilians. Soviet troops, advancing beyond pre-war borders, confronted unfamiliar languages and social structures, while regulations sought to control interactions with local populations and Allied forces. German and Hungarian soldiers, fighting closer to their own national territories, faced the prospect of war reaching their homelands. Civilians from Romania to Yugoslavia and Hungary experienced rapid changes in administrative authority, varying treatment by different occupying and liberating forces, and divergent expectations about post-war political arrangements. Tolbukhin's headquarters had to integrate these military and civilian factors into operational planning. Coordination with new allies, adjustments to lines of communication, and responses to German and Hungarian countermeasures required flexible use of fronts, armies, and supporting air and artillery formations. The ability of the Third Ukrainian Front to shift from offensive breakthroughs to defensive preparations, and back again, in a multinational environment, exemplified the broader pattern of resistance and adaptation that characterized the Southern Theatre as the war approached its final year. The convergence of multiple campaigns in late 1944 and early 1945 produced a turning point not only for the southern axis of the war, but also for Tolbukhin's role within it. Militarily, the destruction of large Axis groupings in the Jassy-Kishinev offensive and the advance through Romania and Bulgaria deprived Germany of allies and exposed its southeastern flank. Politically, Romania's switch of sides and Bulgaria's subsequent alignment with the Soviet coalition altered the composition of forces under Tolbukhin's operational umbrella. His Third Ukrainian Front now deployed Soviet armies alongside Romanian and Bulgarian formations, moving through Yugoslav territory in cooperation with partisan forces and pushing toward the borders of Hungary and Austria. The siege and fall of Budapest in late 1944 and early 1945 represented one layer of this turning point. While Second Ukrainian Front bore much of the direct responsibility for operations around the city, Tolbukhin's armies contributed to the encirclement and to blocking German relief attempts from the south and west. The reduction of the Budapest pocket removed a major German strongpoint on the Danube and opened routes for further advances toward Vienna. At the same time, the fighting highlighted the costs of urban warfare, the strain on logistics, and the need for careful coordination between multiple fronts and Allied contingents operating in adjacent sectors. The German counteroffensive near Lake Balaton in March 1945 formed another critical episode. Designed to secure remaining oil resources in western Hungary and to disrupt Soviet preparations for an advance into Austria, the operation concentrated Panzer and SS formations against the junction of 3rd and 2nd Ukrainian fronts. Tolbukhin's staff, drawing on intelligence about German force concentrations, prepared layered defences with anti-tank zones, minefields, and artillery groupings in depth. When the offensive began, Soviet and Allied units absorbed the initial blows, yielding limited ground while focusing on preserving cohesion and attriting attacking armoured units. The failure of the German operation, despite significant local strength, marked the last major offensive effort by the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. This outcome shifted momentum decisively. With German reserves in the region depleted and losses in tanks and experienced personnel difficult to replace, the initiative passed fully to the Soviet side on the southern axis. For Tolbukhin, the successful defence around Lake Balaton confirmed that his front could withstand concentrated counterattacks while maintaining readiness for a renewed offensive. It also reassured political leaders in Moscow and in the newly aligned capitals of Bucharest and Sofia that the coalition's southern flank would not be broken in the final phase of the war. The subsequent Vienna offensive in March-April 1945 translated this regained initiative into territorial and political results. Tolbukhin's 3rd Ukrainian Front advanced through western Hungary and across the Austrian border, coordinating with 2nd Ukrainian Front on its northern side. Operations combined river crossings over the Rab and other waterways, battles for transport hubs, and encirclement maneuvers aimed at preventing German forces from establishing a stable line in front of Vienna. Urban combat within the Austrian capital involved street-by-street and building-by-building fighting, while commanders attempted to limit damage to key infrastructure and cultural sites where possible, within the constraints of military necessity and the resistance encountered. For German and Austrian troops defending Vienna and its approaches, this period represented a final attempt to delay the war's arrival in central Austria and southern Germany. Units withdrawn from other sectors or rebuilt after earlier losses manned improvised defences, supported by remaining armoured and artillery assets. The collapse of positions around the city, however, reflected cumulative factors: the loss of oil supplies, the strain on rail transport, reduced air cover, and the attrition inflicted in earlier operations from the Dnieper basin to Hungary. For civilians in Hungary and Austria, the turning point carried multiple meanings. In areas traversed by the front, the end of German control meant exposure to new authorities, requisitions, and the uncertainties of occupation and post-war settlement. In Budapest and Vienna, the final battles brought further destruction to housing, cultural institutions, and industrial facilities that had already been affected by air raids and earlier fighting. At the same time, the conclusion of major combat operations promised an end to deportations, forced labour, and the continuous presence of frontline units in urban centres, even as new political structures began to form under Soviet and Allied influence. Taken together, the thwarting of the German Balaton offensive and the subsequent advance to and capture of Vienna marked the operational and strategic turning point of Tolbukhin's southern campaign. From this stage onward, his front no longer faced the prospect of major enemy counter-offensives on its sector. Instead, it shifted toward occupation duties, demobilization planning, and coordination with emerging post-war administrations in the Balkans and Austria. The combination of defensive success and offensive follow-through in early 1945 would later be cited by military analysts as characteristic of Tolbukhin's approach. Careful preparation, layered defense, and methodical exploitation of opportunities once the enemy's capacity for large-scale maneuver had been broken. With the fall of Vienna and the cessation of major German offensive activity on the southern axis, the operations of Third Ukrainian Front shifted from continuous combat to a mix of pursuit, consolidation, and occupation. German and Hungarian formations that remained in being attempted to withdraw westward toward the Alps or to reach zones where they hoped to surrender to Western Allied forces. Columns of troops moved along overcrowded roads, mingling with civilian refugees, remnants of administrative services, and equipment convoys. In many cases, these withdrawals were disrupted by destroyed bridges, fuel shortages, and the presence of Soviet blocking detachments, leading to fragmented surrenders and local pockets of resistance, rather than a single, orderly evacuation. For Soviet and Allied units under Tolbukhin's command, the end of large-scale fighting did not mean an immediate halt to casualties or operations. Rearguard engagements continued as isolated German or Hungarian groups attempted to break through encircling forces or to escape into mountainous terrain. Engineers were tasked with clearing mines and unexploded ordnance from roads, fields, and urban districts, while security units guarded depots, communication nodes, and administrative centers. The front's logistics system, which had long been oriented toward pushing supplies forward for offensives, now had to support prolonged deployments in foreign territories and to begin preparations for the reduction of strength and redeployment of formations. Prisoners of war formed a significant part of the immediate aftermath. In earlier campaigns, such as Jassy-Kishinev and Crimea, encirclement operations had produced large numbers of German and Romanian captives. The later fighting in Hungary and Austria added further groups. Under existing regulations, these prisoners were disarmed, registered, and concentrated in temporary camps before being transferred to more permanent facilities in the Soviet rear or in liberated countries. Their treatment and subsequent employment reflected both international norms and the Soviet state's need for labor in reconstruction, and varied according to rank, nationality, and the local security situation. For Tolbukhin's headquarters, the practical issue was to process and evacuate these groups without overburdening frontline units or disrupting supply routes. The civilian aftermath extended across a broad geographic area. In Crimea, the change of control in 1944 had been followed by deportations and administrative reorganization. In Romania and Bulgaria, where governments had switched sides, the presence of Soviet troops coincided with political realignments and the emergence of new security and party structures. In Yugoslavia, the entry of Soviet formations into Belgrade and other regions intersected with the consolidation of power by partisan forces that had fought a separate, long-running war of resistance. In Hungary and Austria, populations experienced the transition from German rule to occupation by Soviet troops, with local administrations being reconstituted or created under Allied supervision. Across these regions, residents contended with shortages of food and fuel, displacement, housing damage, and the challenges of living in zones traversed by multiple armies. Withdrawal and demobilization proceeded in stages. As major combat operations ended, some Soviet divisions were earmarked for transfer back toward the Soviet Union, where they would eventually be reduced in strength or disbanded. Others remained as occupation forces or as part of garrisons in key areas, including parts of Austria and the Balkans. Third Ukrainian Front structure itself began to change. Headquarters functions were redirected from planning large offensives to managing military government responsibilities, coordinating with local authorities, and overseeing the repatriation or relocation of Soviet citizens and prisoners of war found in liberated territories. For officers and soldiers who had served continuously since the Southern campaigns of 1943, this period marked a transition from frontline warfare to tasks associated with stabilization and reconstruction. German and Axis withdrawal patterns from the Southern theatre influenced post-war borders and political arrangements. The destruction or surrender of German Sixth Army groupings in Romania, the collapse of positions in Hungary, and the loss of Vienna reduced the Wehrmacht's ability to influence developments in the Balkans and Central Europe. The timing and location of withdrawals or capitulations affected which Allied forces occupied specific regions at the moment of Germany's final surrender, shaping later discussions over zones of control. In Romania and Bulgaria, the earlier shift of allegiance and the presence of Soviet forces created conditions for governments aligned with Moscow. In Yugoslavia, the combination of domestic partisan strength and temporary Soviet military presence contributed to a distinct post-war trajectory. Within the Red Army and the wider Soviet system, the aftermath also involved assessment of front and army commanders. Tolbukhin was promoted to the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union and received high decorations for his role in the campaigns from the lower Dnieper to Vienna. Evaluations of his command highlighted the absence of major operational defeats on his sectors after 1943, and the series of successful offensives conducted by his fronts in cooperation with neighbouring formations and Allied armies. At the same time, the redistribution of forces, the integration of new allies, and the shift to occupation duties meant that many of the staff and units that had served under him in the decisive campaigns were dispersed or reassigned, carrying their experiences into peacetime structures. For the individuals who had lived and fought along the Southern Axis, Soviet soldiers, German and Hungarian troops, Romanian and Bulgarian units, Yugoslav partisans, and civilians in territories from the Black Sea to the Alps, the aftermath of Third Ukrainian Front's operations was measured less in formal boundary changes than in immediate conditions of survival and adaptation. Reconstruction of transport networks, restoration of basic services, return or resettlement of displaced persons, and the establishment of new political administrations formed the practical framework within which the memory of the campaigns was shaped. Against this background, the record of Tolbukhin's front, from Melitopol and Crimea to Jassy Kishinev, Belgrade, Lake Balaton, and Vienna, moved from operational reports into the broader processes of commemoration, analysis, and state narratives that would define its place in post-war history. In retrospect, the sequence of operations conducted by Southern, 4th Ukrainian, and 3rd Ukrainian fronts under Tolbukhin forms a coherent pattern rather than a series of isolated battles. From Melitopol through Crimea, Jassy Kishinev, Belgrade, the Balaton sector, and Vienna, his commands did not experience large-scale operational encirclements or collapses comparable to those that affected other formations earlier in the war. Where German and Axis forces suffered pockets, forced evacuations, or the loss of major groupings, Tolbukhin's fronts absorbed counterblows and maintained cohesion. This record did not result from a single doctrine, but from repeated application of certain principles, concentration of force on selected axes, careful preparation of artillery and logistics, readiness to shift the main effort when resistance proved stronger than expected, and coordination with neighbouring fronts and Allied armies. Comparative analysis with other Soviet commanders highlights both similarities and differences. Zhukov and Konev operated in sectors associated with the defence of Moscow, the Battle of Kursk, the Vistula-Oder advance, and the capture of Berlin, where political visibility and symbolic weight were high. Their offensives sometimes involved very rapid advances that risked overextension and required later correction. Tolbukhin's operations on the Southern Axis, by contrast, were more often framed as the systematic reduction of enemy groupings, and the securing of lines of communication toward the Balkans and Central Europe. The destruction of German Sixth Army elements in Jassy-Kishinev, the elimination of Axis forces in Crimea, and the defeat of the Lake Balaton offensive illustrate a preference for encirclement and defensive depth, rather than for singular, high-profile thrusts. Foreign and adversary sources provide an additional perspective. German operational studies after the war, as well as analyses by Western military historians, note the effectiveness of Soviet southern offensives in 1944 to 1945, and often single out the Jassy-Kishinev encirclement as an example of coordinated deep operations. These works emphasize the impact of overwhelming material superiority in some sectors, but also acknowledge the planning and execution by front commands. In such studies, Tolbukhin appears as a competent and reliable commander whose formations consistently achieved their assigned tasks, even when facing German armoured counterattacks or complex coalition operations in the Balkans. Yet his name is less prominent in popular narratives, which tend to focus on more familiar fronts and personalities. Several factors help explain this relative lack of visibility. First, the sectors where Tolbukhin operated, though strategically significant, did not become central symbols in Soviet and later international memory to the same degree as Moscow, Stalingrad, or Berlin. The liberation of Crimea, the advance through Romania and Bulgaria, and the capture of Vienna were important, but were integrated into wider narratives about the collapse of the Axis rather than singled out as defining moments. Second, Tolbukhin died in 1949, before the large post-war wave of memoirs, interviews, and public appearances that helped shape the reputations of some of his contemporaries. His role was therefore mediated largely through staff documents, official histories, and the recognition granted by state awards. Political and national factors also played a part. Tolbukhin's family background included Bulgarian roots, and his name became associated in particular with the Soviet advance into the Balkans. In Bulgaria, he was commemorated through place names and monuments, but in the Soviet Union, the complex post-war politics of the region, including the later split with Yugoslavia, made the southern campaigns more sensitive subjects in public discussion. Within a historiography that often linked commanders to emblematic battles on Soviet soil or in Germany itself, a figure whose most visible achievements lay in multinational operations through Romania, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Hungary, and Austria, occupied a more specialized niche. In the decades after 1945, interpretations of Tolbukhin's career followed broader trends in Eastern European and global historiography. Soviet and Warsaw Pact publications emphasized his role as a liberator of Balkan capitals and as a marshal of the Soviet Union, while Western works increasingly analyzed his operations as case studies in coalition warfare and deep battle. After the end of the Cold War, archives in several countries opened more material on both Soviet and Axis planning, enabling more detailed studies of his campaigns and of the interactions between Third Ukrainian Front and local forces. These works tend to converge on an assessment of Tolbukhin as a front commander whose formations consistently met their operational objectives and avoided large-scale reverses, even under challenging conditions. For soldiers and civilians who experienced the movements of his fronts, Tolbukhin's legacy remains embedded in specific places and memories. The ruins and reconstructed streets of Sevastopol, the landscapes around Jassy and Kishinev, the routes into Belgrade, the fields near Lake Balaton, the districts of Vienna where artillery and tanks once fought block by block. In each of these locations, the actions of Third Ukrainian Front intersected with local histories, political realignments, and post-war narratives of liberation, occupation, or national struggle. Viewed from this wider perspective, the record of Tolbukhin's southern campaigns illustrates how a front commander could shape the course of the war without becoming a central figure in popular memory. His operations contributed to the strategic unraveling of Germany's southern alliances, the destruction of key formations, and the alignment of much of southeastern Europe with the post-war Soviet sphere. The relative absence of major defeats on his sectors reflects both the growing strength of the Red Army and the specific choices made in planning and execution. The balance between these structural and individual factors, and the question of why Tolbukhin's name is less familiar than those of some counterparts, remain subjects for ongoing historical debate rather than a settled verdict, underscoring the complexity of assessing command performance in a multinational, multi-theatre war.